are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
He actually explains it in his preaching book. This is what I'm trying to do when I preach. I do these 4 or 5 things. Oftentimes when I listen to his messages, I hear him get to that 4th kind of area where now in Jesus you can. And that turn he makes toward the gospel of Jesus Christ is it's so beautiful. Many times when I'm listening to it, I feel so moved. But then oftentimes when I get to that 4th point, it sounds like the application becomes, so now you must believe this, or now you must think this. And like, here, let me tell you how important it is for you to change your thinking about this. And I was having this conversation with this brilliant young guy who was interning here at the Evanston Vineyard, who now he's doing a PhD at Wheaton. And he was saying the Vineyard version of this to me feels like there's a 5th step. And at the 5th step, it's the Box Canyon and the Spirit coming in to sweep us up. The 5th step is we cannot do this. Jesus gives us the power to do it through the Spirit. I think that was a real critical inflection point in my preaching when I realized, the way that I don't meme or imitate these folks is that I think about my rootedness in the Vineyard movement and think about what it means to be a Vineyard person as I approach these beautiful texts. That's helped me go beyond, or at least not go beyond. I wouldn't say I've ever gone beyond Tim Keller, but that's helped me to go beyond just imitation to, okay, what do I really want to say to the church?
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. Today we are launching a preaching mini-series that will be hosted by Adam Russell, the lead pastor of the Campbellsville Vineyard Church in Kentucky and director of Vineyard Worship, and Ted Kim, who is the lead pastor of the Evanston Vineyard in Illinois. In this special series, they will interview different pastors within the Vineyard and dig into some of the most important aspects of preaching. Today's episode is an introduction to this special series where they'll be talking about finding your unique voice as a preacher. Let's listen in.
All right, what's up, everybody? I'm Adam. My friend Ted is here. This is the We Are Vineyard podcast, and we're talking about preaching. And today, I think what we're going to talk about, Ted, is finding your voice. Something like that. Finding your voice because, man, I don't know. It takes a while to figure out who you are, not only as a person, but then when you stand up in front of people, there's just levels to this thing, aren't there?
Lots of levels. I just as a caveat, I don't think I found my voice. I'm still trying to figure that out.
I don't know, Ted. I think you're settling in, man. Dude. Well, that's the goal today. That's the conversation that Ted and I want to have. We want to talk about finding your voice. If you want to say style, that's fine. I'm fine with that. Or finding who you are as a preacher or a proclaimer of good news, especially when you're doing it in front of all these people every single Sunday, carrying that conversation. There's just so many ways in which all of our little insecurities pop up, all of our quirks and mannerisms come under the microscope, and it's a journey, isn't it, Ted?
Well, it's a journey, and they all have beginnings, don't they?
That's right. They totally do.
So I'm curious, Adam, if you could talk about your beginning. What's your story? How did you start preaching?
Ted, here's what's weird. I mean, I spent a long time like you as a worship leader. So I led a lot of worship and I loved that. Felt very called to it. Still feel so connected to the worship side of the world that's in church. But from my very earliest childhood memories, I felt called to preach, which is very strange. I don't have a lot of early childhood memories that are present to me, but the feeling of being a preacher was just in me. And if I just sort of skip like a stone across a couple things that seemed to be formative for me. So there's that internal feeling. I call it calling. I didn't know what to call it early on. Then when I was in high school, had a very interesting moment with a history teacher. Shout out to Miss Betty Gorin. She was an absolute genius. And she had us do oral presentations. And this is my sophomore year. And I get up and do a 5.5, 6 minute oral presentation about Reconstruction. And I'm walking back to my desk and I'm about to sit down. And Miss Betty Gorin Smith, she says, Adam, hey, before you sit down, she said, you'll either be a politician or you'll be a preacher because you're an orator. And she used the word orator with me, which was so strange. But in that moment, it felt like something came on me. Now, looking back, I know it's prophetic encouragement. It's the weight and the calling of the Spirit. And even though I don't think she was particularly, I mean, she's a Christian, I know that, but she's not charismatic in any way. I just felt like she prophesied to me. And it was amazing to be seen by someone else. It gave me faith for it in the weirdest way. So I think part of my journey is feeling like a preacher or feeling called to be a preacher, and then being noticed as a speaker, even as a sophomore who was very insecure and didn't want to be on stage. And like I said a moment ago, I was a worship leader and then just was leading stuff at church, and Ray Hollenbach, my spiritual father, kept pushing me to hold a microphone and to lead a meeting. Adam, why don't you lead this part of the meeting? Why don't you lead this part of the meeting? Just getting me to be comfortable being in front of people and working it out. And then, he invited me to preach one Sunday, and I'll never forget, my first sermon was on Mark chapter 5, the healing of Jairus' daughter. That's my first sermon. And Ted, what threw me off was having my parents in the room. So that was like the thing that really initially threw me off. Just having my mom and dad in the room, I had to overcome, I don't know what that is. I still can't name it. But being in front of other people at that point wasn't so uncomfortable to me, but maybe being in front of my mom and dad, So that's like some of my early history. Why don't you talk to me just for a minute about being kind of a lifelong worship leader and a leader in church, but then you transitioned to being a preacher. I mean, and big time pastor now. Come on, what are we talking about?
I'm curious if you had an experience that was similar to mine, and that's I felt like something was happening inside of me. So I was leading worship, doing a lot of that, but then I could feel this thing that was starting to shift for me, where every time I stood in front of a microphone, I wanted to explain what we were about to do.
Yeah.
Rather than sing. In fact, I was getting more excited about, let me just frame what we were about to do over the next 20 to 25 minutes. And to be frank, Adam, I think that I've always felt called to preach.
Yeah.
But I think that I have run from it.
Oh, say more about that, because I think that's kind of a common experience.
Well, I think that from a very early age, in a way that a call to preach might be actually, there was a way in which your teacher made you feel very seen in that moment.
Yes.
I think there's maybe like almost a bit of a stigma about being a pastor in the Korean church. And that stigma is that you basically become a pastor if you don't have any other options. So, because, Korea is so Christianized, and my parents are Korean immigrants. And so they're like, if you can do anything else but this, because it seems to be the sort of like the place where people who can't make it in professional degrees or whatnot. So there was that piece of it. It was almost a bit stigmatized. And then, the Korean church phenomenon, sort of like in the 90s, the Korean American church, where there was like just a raft of immigrants that had come over. And so there were these immigrant churches that would have all these English ministries. So in a way, we were just trying to figure out who we were in a new country. We were trying to balance two different like ethnic identities between, like having an immigrant culture that we were seeing face to face every Sunday and also Wednesday. And then we'd spend New Year's Eves together. I mean, that's a very Korean thing to do. I think feeling a lot of that struggle, especially the struggle of the immigrant, and then also the struggle of trying to fit into these different places, it just felt like one of the easy ways to circumvent a lot of those challenges was to have actually some means and some affluence. And so I think I resisted in myself because I think I knew how hard it would be. And then my parents would always tell me, this is like the hardest thing you could ever do, like pastoring,
Yeah.
preaching, to be in front of people. And if you can do anything else, do it. But then also had internal resistance too. And I think that internal resistance, it really got dialed down when I went to one of those Vineyard worship leader retreats in the Northeast that we used to do.
Yeah.
And those retreats were just so powerful for me because they always ended up being these extended conversations with God that I would have. So I'd arrive, and then by the time that the week was done, I would have probably had this long ongoing conversation with God about who I am and what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And at one of those retreats, I felt like the Lord very clearly said to me, there is a reason why you resist preaching. And there's a reason why you resist this thing that you have always felt in the back of your, kind of like in the back of your head, in the back of your heart, that you were supposed to do. And that's because you think you need to be a certain type of person to do that. And I'm asking you to be yourself. And so at that moment, it felt like, it was sort of like one of those moments that you have when you just know, oh, okay, I have a very kind God who's going to take me with him as he does this. And my walls came down at that point. And then it just became almost unbearable. Every time I stood in front of a microphone, I just wanted to talk and not sing.
Yeah.
Did you have that experience too?
Oh, yeah.
Adam?
I mean, at a certain point, I mean, this is not everybody's experience, but it's yours, it's mine. I think it's a common Vineyard story. At a certain point of leading worship, if you're actually called to pastor and to preach, a leading worship kind of just becomes anathema. You're like, I can't do it anymore. I remember the last year and a half that I led worship, I was thinking internally, someone get this guitar off of me.
Yeah.
Just get this guitar off of me and let me. It's the strangest thing, but it's like, let me just help this room. You know what I'm saying? Like let me just, you said it a moment ago, frame what's about to happen. Let me
That's
get
right.
everybody on the same page. That's what was in my heart, you know? And then at the same time, there's also this part of me that's like, it sometimes comes out as coach energy, but it's just like, I want to tell people the good news of Jesus. And I can't, and what's in my heart, actually, it has to be spoken and it can't just be sung. You know, there's something in me and I can't express it in a song. I need to preach this thing. So yeah, I'm totally on board with you there.
Do you think that, so I would say there are a number of preachers that I listen to. You're one of them, Adam. And one of the reasons why I like listening to you is because I feel like I'm listening to Adam preach. Like my friend Adam is preaching. There are other reasons why I like it too. But in a way, it feels very much like this is the authentic Adam talking and preaching to me. And there's something about that too that I think our church recognizes. The Evanston Vineyard, when you've come and you've preached, it's almost already like there's a friendship that happens between you and the church. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that you seem pretty comfortable in your own skin. So it's almost like you found your voice. I've heard people say that it takes some time to do that. Have you found that to be true? I mean, how long did it take you to feel sort of comfortable in your skin?
I don't know, 10 years, Ted? I mean, I don't know if it was a decade, but it was probably very close. I mean, Ted, I was so insecure. Especially as a young man. I'm, thinking about myself as 18, 21, even 25. And by the time I'm 25, and even earlier, I'm projecting strength, but I'm actually insecure. And so there's something about preaching that just brings to the surface all your insecurities. And I'll just tell you, my first major insecurity when I was actually preaching at the church, it really wasn't about standing on the stage and being in front of people or, weird mannerisms or anything like that. It wasn't so much that, but it was the insecurity of being a theological fraud, or I'm going to form these people in a way that's going to make them unchristian, or I'm going to tell the story of Jesus wrong, right? I mean, by this point, I'm in my mid-20s. I'm starting to preach a little bit. Even by the time I'm 30, when I take over the church here and preach all the time, I'm still really dealing with insecurity, big time. And especially this idea of being a theological imposter. At this point, maybe I'm listening to some people who are really good preachers and who are great communicators. I just remember in those days listening to Rich Nathan, or there's a Jack Deere sermon that I will never forget as long as I live that just shattered me. There were a couple of messages that I got a hold of from Steve Nicholson and a handful of others, and I'm just, then you compare yourself to them. You're like, oh man, you can just tell they know the Bible. You can tell they know God, and they can so easily and clearly work their way through thorny issues. And then I just feel like I get up on Sunday morning here in Campbellsville and I'm just a fraud, right? So that thing that you're talking about of being comfortable in your own skin, for me, it was like a journey of battling through theological formation and feeling like that even the little bit that I have, God was going to use it. And I don't have to be those people. Like I don't have to be, like, God's not asking me to preach like Rich Nathan. God's not asking me to be like Jack Deere or somebody who has an itinerant ministry. That's actually not the goal. It's something much different. My spiritual father, Ray Hollenbach, he would over and over, he said it to me, 1,000 times. He would always say to me, Adam, settle down. It's already in you. It's already in you. And that was his way of saying, like, be you. Like, the Spirit, trust that God is doing things in you, and it's for us. So, yeah, man, that was such a big deal.
So how long can you just talk about what you did to kind of work through that?
Yeah, I think if I'm just going to be very linear here, one thing is having a spiritual father in my life who kept recalibrating me with encouragement. Ray was so encouraging to me. So, just even his thing of it's already in you. When I would preach, Ray would sit on the front row and take notes. It's so silly, and I even knew it was silly, but it touched my heart, and then he would come in and be like, Adam, here are the things that I really heard from God this morning as you spoke. It's just silly, but he wasn't acting either. I could tell he was being genuine. So, having a spiritual father who's just helping me. I would also say, Ted, really powerful encounters with the Spirit. So my younger life in the Lord was marked by profound experiences of renewal, which I've talked about on various formats on the podcast. But, just if you want to say it in one manner of speaking, just getting slammed by the Holy Spirit on the ground with the power of the Lord, right? And at the time, I didn't really know what was happening. A lot of times there were a lot of tears. And I think there's a lot of things, a lot of inner healing happening in my life. But I think one of the things the Lord was doing through these encounters with the power of God is he was taking insecurity off of me. Literally just taking that stuff out of me and putting his strength in me. When I got first baptized with the Holy Spirit, the first thing that popped through for me in terms of gifts was prophecy. It wasn't speaking in tongues. It was proclamation. When I got really touched by the Holy Spirit, I popped up and I started prophesying to people and basically preaching the good news in a prophetic way, right? So this was this journey of like, I've got a spiritual father. He's encouraging me, powerful experiences of the Spirit. And then there's just something that happens as you get older. You realize, oh man, everybody's insecure. This thing is a journey. And then there's something about reps, right? You just do something longer. You build a kind of muscle memory. And if you go back and you review some of the stuff that you've done, you're like, that was a little weak. I could do that better. Or why am I consistently hung up in this kind of a little box canyon in my preaching? I started noticing some of the box canyons I would get into, like over-explaining something that no one in the room cares about or isn't important. Right. It just isn't important. Right. It felt important to me, but isn't. And learning how to just wiggle your way through some of those kinds of things. And, but honestly, Ted, I think it took me 10 years. I don't think I settled until I was like 35.
Hmm. Well, I feel super tender to what you're saying and just feel kind of the weight of that.
Mm.
And I feel conscious of the people that are listening that may sort of be in that journey. Maybe they're 2 or 3 years in, maybe they're 4 or 5 years in. And if I could just repeat back to you what I hear you saying is two things that I think feel like really important because they're part of my story too. And that's one, having a spiritual father. I have the spiritual father in Steve Nicholson, and he does the same thing for me. He speaks words of encouragement to me, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I read them over and over and over again when he sends them an email.
Yes.
I do. I read them over and over and over again. And it's not actually to build up my ego. It's actually give me courage. It feels like it gives me courage when I have a spiritual father that gives me the kind of encouragement. And if you're listening today, that just feels super, super important to have someone in your corner who has done this for a long time, who can get you to settle down. And the other thing that I hear you saying is that there's something about shedding this insecurity or this fear of man that is the work of the Spirit.
It's the only way it comes off.
Yeah,
That's
I love
it.
that.
It's the only way it comes off. This is not to aggrandize myself in any way, because I just think this is true. It's just true for anybody, especially for people who are preaching. But you know that moment in Acts chapter 4 when the apostles are before the Sanhedrin and they're like, you guys got to quit talking about Jesus. And they're like, we will not. And there's this moment in there right before they say we will not, where it says they were filled with the Spirit. But the filling of the Spirit in that moment was like boldness. And It was courage. It was like, and that happens over and over again in the book of Acts. Like so many of the fillings of the Spirit are not about other spiritual gifts or even speaking in tongues, even though that is a feature in Acts. It's about boldness and courage. And that's been my story. Like my courage came from God. It just did. And it took a while for that to work out. I would go back to insecurity because that was my pattern. That was my formation. And then God would keep encouraging me with the power of the Spirit. And, those Acts 4 passages, they feel very personal to me because early on, I felt so weak, especially when I had enough sense to know what good was. And I was so far from it. And I just felt so small. And it was the Lord who really helped me. So I'm with you, Ted. Spiritual fathers and filling of the Spirit.
And the filling of the Spirit and the power of the Spirit and the Spirit invading like our box canyon, to use a phrase. I mean, like this is something that feels so important to me that there is beyond what we can do, something that we cannot do but can do because of the Spirit. And I'm just wondering if that kind of what you just said about Acts 4, I'm wondering if that has made its way into your life message or into your,
oh, dude,
like, how is that kind of like part of the story that you always tell?
Yeah. So it's part of the story I always tell if I'm talking about the empowerment of the Spirit. So if I'm going to preach about the power of the Spirit, then that is always a part of my story. That the infilling of the Spirit, what it first did to me was gave me courage. And also, and it's, there's all these little things that you just start noticing. The stories that are told in the Bible, they're told about courageous people who oftentimes weren't courageous at the beginning.
That's right.
But there's just so many courageous people who are in the Bible, and it's always because that's what the Spirit does. It gives you courage. So, yeah, man, I don't know if that's my life message, my message inside of all the messages that keeps popping out. But if I'm talking about the power of the Spirit or being empowered by the Holy Ghost, yes, sir, I always come back to courage. Ted, can I just shift gears and ask you something now?
Yeah,
all right.
Of course.
All right. We've been talking about a bunch of stuff, formation and finding your voice. Let me ask you this. How do you get inspiration from someone without becoming a meme of them? Like I just think about this, if you're our age and you're kind of like a Vineyard person, you probably listen to a lot of Rich Nathan, or maybe you listen to a lot of Tim Keller. How do you take the good from these people without becoming a really bad version of Tim Keller? Does that make sense? How do you not put on Saul's armor?
And I don't know how to answer that question in any way that's like I'm probably a meme. I mean, like of any number of an amalgamation of like a bunch of people that are inspirational for me.
Yes,
but I would say that I can say for myself that I love the late Tim Keller.
Yes,
but I also try not just to listen to the late Tim Keller. I also try to listen to other people like Dr. Charlie Dates, who's here in Chicago and has just taken over this massive historically Black church called Salem Baptist Church in the south side of our city, who preaches a little bit differently. He preaches in his skin.
Yeah.
And of course, I listen to people in the Vineyard, and I think that for me, I got so far down the Tim Keller rabbit hole that it wasn't so much that I was copying what he was doing, but it was that I think that I tried to take his context, which was New York City, and sort of like paste it onto my context.
Mm.
And so it wasn't so much that I was trying to meme him or imitate him, but I think that I thought, well, he has such a good pulse on what today's culture is. I think that will just transfer onto our culture. And that has not proved to be true. We are different. We're Chicago. We're different than New York City. I mean, we're a much different church than he had.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that I thought of. And the other thing, just in terms of learning how to recontextualize, like sort of his intellectual, I mean, he's just a giant. He's a genius.
Yeah.
But he teaches the importance of like the preaching the gospel into a particular place and time that I thought, well, I can just copy the place and time. So that's the first thing for me.
Yeah.
Like learning to think about my city and to think about its unique concerns, its unique strengths, its like unique challenges. But then also I read his book on preaching, and I got to the end of his book and I thought, there's something missing for me. He would not have said this, I'm sure. I mean, like he would maybe, totally agree with me, but I just felt like if I was going to take his approach, which goes something like, here's what the text tells you that you must do. Here's why you cannot actually do it. Here's how Jesus actually did it and fulfilled it. And now here's how Jesus helps you to do that. I mean, that's kind of like a basic form. He always very Christological, always goes back to Jesus, very expository, always preaching the text. I love that. And so I'm like, I want to preach the text. He's one of the best. So I think I'll copy him, or I'll not copy him, but at least learn from him.
So that was what you pulled, though. You pulled that sort of frame.
Well, he actually explains it in his preaching book. This is what I'm trying to do when I preach. I do these 4 or 5 things. He gets to the 4th point, though, and oftentimes when I listen to his messages, I hear him get to that 4th kind of area where now in Jesus you can. And that turn he makes toward the gospel of Jesus Christ it's so beautiful. Many times when I'm listening to it, I feel so moved. But then oftentimes when I get to that 4th point, it sounds like the application becomes, so now you must believe this, or now you must think this. And like, here, let me tell you how important it is for you to change your thinking about this. And I was having this conversation with this brilliant young guy who was interning here at the Evanston Vineyard, who now he's doing a PhD at Wheaton. And he was saying the Vineyard version of this to me feels like there's a 5th step. Mm. And at the 5th step, it's the Box Canyon and the Spirit coming in to sweep us up. Mm. The 5th step is we cannot do this. Jesus gives us the power to do it through the Spirit. Mm. For me, that was a really critical, I think that was a real critical inflection point in my preaching when I realized, the way that I don't meme or imitate these folks is that I think about my like rootedness in the Vineyard movement and think about what it means to be a Vineyard person as I approach these beautiful texts. And that's helped me go beyond, or at least not go beyond. I wouldn't say I've ever gone beyond Tim Keller, but that's helped me to go beyond like just imitation to, okay, what do I really want to say to the church?
This summer, Vineyard USA is hosting our national conference, Seed and Soil, in 2 locations, Denver, Colorado on June 17th through 20th, and Cincinnati, Ohio on July 15th through 18th. We hope that by offering 2 locations and dates, everyone, pastors, leaders, volunteers, even those just curious about the Vineyard, everyone will be able to find a time to join us. The conference will have specific programming for adults, youth, and kids, while we focus on cultivating healthy soil in our hearts and planting seeds for the future for all that God wants to do in us and in the Vineyard. Registration is now open with early bird pricing, so make sure to check out vineyardusa.org to learn more and register today.
Well, and okay, so I just want to reflect back to you what I hear you saying. I kind of hear you saying that at the beginning of your journey, maybe you did imitate Tim a little bit.
I did a little bit. Yeah.
Well, but you know what? But Ted, isn't that the way that we all grow? Like kids learn how to speak by imitating their parents, right? Like you learn how to play a sport by imitating your coach, or you if you're my age, you learn how to shoot basketball by trying to be Michael Jordan.
Right.
And you realize really quickly, I am not Michael Jordan. But yeah, there's something there. I think maybe, for people who are just beginning their preaching journey, it's probably almost unavoidable. You're going to kind of imitate some people. And then it becomes a springboard to where you collect that best part or whatever, and it becomes a part of who you are.
That's right. And I would say that the thing that Keller does maybe better than anybody that I listen to, I mean, Dates is great too, but is that turn toward the gospel. He always turns toward the good news of Jesus Christ and his messages. And that is the thing I really treasure. Like, how can we make that turn? Even if we're preaching Genesis 2 or we're preaching, I know that exegetically, I know that like scholars would say, hey, let's not put Christ too much into the scriptures there, and whatnot.
Yeah.
But I'm just like, I think the beauty of preaching is to be able to preach the text in a way that exalts Christ, and then gets us to the point of our surrender to him, and whatever that looks like. So I think Keller is super instructive for me in that. And yes, I quoted Keller a lot. I mean, that's the other thing that you can do just to not become a meme. You can just say, hey, I borrowed this from Tim Keller this morning.
Yeah, that's right.
Here's this outline. I just think it's so convincing. I never took copious notes of Keller's messages. I always just would listen to him and let my mind wander as I would do that. I would listen to preachers, just let my mind wander. And that often helps me feel like I'm getting a primer, like the car is getting jump started a bit, because that blank page when you're starting, it's intimidating. You're like, how am I going to start? What am I going to actually do?
Talk to me about that. I'm glad you brought it up. Just riff there for a minute. Talk to me about blank pages. You sit down. It's Wednesday afternoon. You're preaching on Sunday. You have 4 hours blocked out. Now what?
A blank page is so hard, isn't it?
Especially early on, because, I mean, that was another one of my insecurities. It's like, how do you even start? I was always looking for the magic, right? Always looking for the magic. Yeah, how do you start, Ted?
Well, I think that this goes back to the Bible for me. It's a lot harder to have a blank page when you have the Bible, which is like the testimony of the story of God. And when I had a blank page and I had a topical message, like I had to pull ideas from my reading or pull ideas from my thinking, that was always so much harder. But I have some training. I went to seminary, so then I could look at the text and go, okay, my training has taught me to make an outline. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm just going to make an outline, and I have no other ambition than to preach the Bible and to help people read it for themselves. That's it.
Yes.
And so then starting with the Bible always felt like, okay, now my blank page is always about the outline. And now as we are teaching young people to come up and preach at our church, I notice that there's always some common mistakes. Like one mistake that I almost always see is that I can see when a manuscript was written with the introduction first. You know, like you know that the introduction was the first thing that got written because it places a governor on the rest of the message. And
Yes.
you know, kind of like, oh, you're trying to fit the message into this idea that you had in the introduction, but the idea really is in the text.
Yeah.
And so get that idea first, and then the introduction and then the conclusion. I mean, they can work themselves out. We know that the conclusion will move us toward ministry. And I have just found that in my introductions, I just want to grab people and that's it. I don't want to take a long time there. If I'm there for longer than 2 to 5 minutes, then I've spent way too much time because I really want to get to the text.
Yes.
So the outline, that's how I do it. What do you do with the blank page, Adam?
With the blank page? I mean, these days, I'm just more comfortable with it. So that would be this is part of that preaching journey, getting comfortable in your own skin, finding your own voice. I don't feel the pressure that I used to. I used to feel so much pressure. I would finish preaching on Sunday, go home, take a nap, and when I got up from my nap, I would start feeling anxiety about the next Sunday. Like, oh man, my words are going to run out. That's another insecurity. My words are going to run out. My ideas are going to run out, which is really almost like that temptation to be novel or to be great. So, that's back to that, getting those insecurities purged from the system, So now the blank page doesn't bother me. Number one, like it's fine. Number two, I work a little further out now, So I'm not just week to week. I try not to be week to week. I try to be a little further out, so that helps. But let's just say, Ted, something crazy happens because it will, as a pastor, it will. Crazy things will happen. Someone will die. You'll have a funeral all of a sudden that you have to do the next day. Or just your family will be crazy and some drama will happen at church and all of your sermon prep time will go away and you'll look up and at some point it's going to be Saturday afternoon and you got nothing. And I've learned to just trust that it's all going to work out. I'm very much like you. I just work through I just try to go, well, what's my text? What's the main point of this text? Where am I feeling the spark of the Spirit? Okay, let's, as I read this, where's the pull for me? Because you could preach David and Goliath 20 ways, 50 ways.
That's so true.
I mean, there's probably 50 messages in there. That was the other thing. Like as a young preacher, you'd hear somebody preach maybe one of these big texts, David and Goliath, or Genesis chapter 3, the fall of Adam and Eve, or, the resurrection in the Gospel of John. He's in the garden. You hear some great preacher preach that and you think, oh, that text, it goes one way. Oh, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Like this is for me, this is where the fun part comes out, is that within the faithful communication of the gospel, you can preach those texts so many ways.
That's right.
So many ways. Like the Spirit is actually part of it. So, for me, I read the text and go, well, where am I feeling the juice? And then I keep sticky notes on my desk. And I just, as the week is going on, as I'm prepping, I'll just read the text and, I'll just, oh, there's some juice. And I'll just write it on a note and I put it on my desk. And then I come back later that afternoon, I read a little bit, pray, another sticky note or two, just random ideas, whatever, pop, pop, pop. And then the next thing you know, after a day or two, or even an afternoon, you come back and you go, wow, my desk is just filled with sticky notes that have, for me, have some juice to them. And then I go, okay, I put my more analytical brain on it and I go, well, what is the message here? And then I have the voice of my spiritual father in my ears Ray, where he's saying, at the end of the message, is there any good news in this for anyone?
That's
Because
right.
it can't just be good ideas or even like interesting theological judo that at the end, it's like, well, so what? Like, why is that good for me? Or good for the people who are here? So yeah, that's kind of like my way of working through the blank page and not getting stuck, just where's the juice? Start writing those little things down. Get away from it. Like if I'm prepping a message in one day, I'll spend some time in the Bible, find that place that inspires me, make a sticky note or two, get an idea of what the main idea is, make a little rough outline of where I think this is going. And then I just have to get out of my office for a few hours. I'll go wash my truck, mow the grass, take the dog for a walk, go on a trail run. And when I'm out doing other things, this is actually really big for me. If I go on a run or if I go on a walk, it's almost like my brain defrags everything I've been reading and praying about, and then it sets it into proper order. I don't know if you've had this experience. And then when I come back to my computer, it's like, here it is, and we're on.
Yeah,
So,
I have a very similar kind of experience, except I have to sleep.
Yes, but that's true. Sleep on it. Yes. Your brain just works things out, doesn't it?
Well, and to just speak of kind of like the dynamic nature of the Spirit in preaching, which I kind of love that we're doing these podcasts, because I do think that preaching is inauspicious in a way that there's it doesn't exist in any other really form in our culture, except for maybe like a lecture at like you're at a university or at a high school or whatnot. And yet we have been preaching for thousands of years, and preaching somehow is one of the signs of the kingdom. Jesus coming and doing proclamation to the people that the kingdom of heaven was near. That was part of the signs that the kingdom was among them, that there was proclamation and communication actually happening. And we can go down a rabbit hole about how important communication is and how important this communication is, because it's like really unmediated, right? It's not like a video. We're actually just talking to people.
Yeah.
And as I've sort of come around, I think I maybe had some wrong ideas around preaching. Like in the beginning, I thought, well, I'm just going to mess with the form and I'm going to do all sorts of different kinds of things and get really creative on Sunday. And I think there is a place for those things, but I'm just struck by the witness of the church over the thousands of years, actually just preaching and preaching and preaching and preaching. And I think it's because in its maybe very best, it is a demonstration of the Spirit and the Spirit's power. And so this sleeping thing and this going out for a trail run thing, so that our mind defrags. Adam, I had so much anxiety when I first started preaching. I would try to get that outline on the paper, and then I'd feel so stuck. I'd go to bed and I'd have a dream with the outline.
Yes.
I would literally, it would be like I was sitting at the feet of God, and all of a sudden I had the outline, and I woke up and I had the outline. I think that taught me from very early on, lean on the Spirit, lean on the Spirit. The prep, I think the prep always felt pretty torturous to me in the beginning because I felt so anxious about it.
Yes.
But then as I've come to do it over time, you're kind of on the hunt for the Spirit, looking for the spark.
Yeah.
And I have felt that if I can kind of surrender this whole teaching thing to Him, the Spirit will show up somehow, even in this very humble thing, us just talking.
Right. Well, it's like our friend John Mark McMillan says about songwriting. If the song doesn't move you, it won't move anyone else. It's like you're hunting for that spark all the time, which is that initiation of the Spirit. Even in the black and white text, I'm looking for that thing. Where is my heart jump? Okay, Ted, let me shift gears again. Talk to me about superpowers and kryptonite. I've been using this frame with my soccer team, coaching I'm coaching soccer right now. I'm coaching middle school soccer. And I often pull my boys aside and I say, hey, come stand beside me. And we have one-on-one chats. And I say, let's talk about superpowers and kryptonite. And I tell the boys, like, hey, this is what I see in you as your superpower, but this is your kryptonite. And I was just thinking about us as preachers, you know?
That's good coaching.
There's superpower and there's kryptonite. What is your superpower in preaching and what's your kryptonite?
I'm super curious to hear what you would say about yourself, Adam.
Okay, yeah, superpower. I think I have a few superpowers, and I've got a few kryptonites. And I don't have one or two. I got a couple. So big moments, superpower for me. If it's going to be heavy, if it's going to be hard, if it's thorny, I get better. So if it feels like this is tightrope walking, I get better. If it feels like, oh man, you could fall off on either side here, that's like a superpower. I get better. Another one of my superpowers is I'll just say fun readings of the text. I love to come to the text imaginatively. I got this really from Robert Capon. It was always inside of me, but I felt permission from Robert Capon. Because all of my other theological formation in school or whatever, I had a lot of voices saying, watch out for heresy. I mean, that's where that thing came from. A lot of my insecurity came from just some of the super reformed Calvinist boys that I came up with in school. I just really felt that. And I was always sort of imaginative. And then with Robert Capon, I just felt the permission to read things really from the side. And then, maybe if you were looking at another voice, even just some of the ways that really great preachers, their sermons have a surprise in them sometimes. And I think that's a superpower for me. Kryptonite for sure. Probably my number one kryptonite is going in for a laugh. So like if something I'm doing connects with the room and I get a laugh, the most dangerous part of the sermon is the next 30 seconds. And I had to learn this about me. Is because it feels so good to turn the room on like that and to get like a real bump or a real pop in the room from something really funny. But it's the most dangerous point in the sermon. Or if I like really stick a landing, like if I'm on the pommel horse with something that's theological or kind of an imaginative reading from the text, and then I'm off the pommel horse and I stick the landing and my arms are up and I kind of like nail it. The most dangerous point of that whole Sunday is the next minute and a half. Because my ego is involved now. Or it's that desire to be awesome. And it's been so dangerous. The dumbest things I've ever said have been the jokes that come after the funny one or the statements that come after the really good one. Right? I start riffing. So riffing can be a strength for me, but man, it can be kryptonite. It can be kryptonite. And honestly, it's soul formation. And I've gotten a little better about it, but mostly right now, Ted, in terms of my own preaching and formation, I'm just aware of it. And so I'm trying to take that awareness with me into Sunday morning. And I'm just trying to be a more grounded, well-rounded person whose ego doesn't need 10 pops on a Sunday. And if there's no pop in my sermon, I'm trying to be the kind of person who's like, okay, that's fine. I did the faithful work of being a preacher. Does that make sense?
It's great. It's super helpful.
Okay, back to you. Let's go superpower and kryptonite.
Well, I think I'm still trying to figure those things out for me.
Well, I can tell you. I can tell you your superpowers. I won't tell you your kryptonite, but I can tell you your superpowers. Okay. I mean, Ted, let me do this and then I'll let you speak. I think part of your superpower is you're so freaking well read and you can take even things like really difficult philosophy and pull it into a conversation or a gospel conversation. And it's like, yes. And also, I think one of your other superpowers is you're so committed to the Spirit. So everything you do, like as I experience it when I'm sitting around, if you're preaching or if you're leading a moment, I experience you as having that prophetic edge. And it's like, oh man, we're not just doing what is in Ted's head, but we're doing, there's like the Spirit is at work in this room with us. Does that make sense? I think for me, these are two of your superpowers.
Oh, wow. I received that. I mean, I do think there is something that you said to me early on in kind of like my journey as a preacher. And you said something about reading and preaching, about like, if you read, you're already halfway there or something like that.
Yes.
Do you remember saying that to me?
Yeah, totally. I do. This was when I remember this, not to get too out in the weeds here, but I just remember like you and I had met at the worship leader retreats and we were fast friends. But then I remember at a certain point where every time I got around you, I was just like, oh man, I think Ted is called to be a pastor and a preacher. And I started sharing this with you. I'm like, man, you need to like, dude, hold the microphone, like get up there, you know? And we were having that kind of conversation and you kind of, you were sharing with me some of your own reticence, right? About any number of things. And it was like, well, I X, Y, Z. And we were just sort of working it out. And I do remember saying, well, Ted, you're a reader. You're like, that's like most of it.
Well, yeah, that's the thing that always stuck with me, because what I've found that the synthesis is probably like one of my superpowers.
Agreed. Great word, synthesis.
So like I remember things that I read a long, long time ago. And the other thing that I found that all the reading matters. It all matters. Whatever you read, it finds its way into, it's almost kind of like in the groundwater. It just finds its way into the message somehow. Like I remember reading something, I just thought maybe I should read more about Karl Barth. So I just read some Karl Barth.
Yes.
And I read it like a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Well, I finally used that reading last week.
Yes.
So it's just the thing that happens. And we cannot underestimate, I don't think, the way that reading forms the way that we think, and everything that we're doing with preaching, like, is informed kind of by how we think about the text, how we think about communicating, and how we think about communicating the good news. I don't know. I've remembered that. And that's been really, really helpful. And I'm always like, if a person wants to learn how to become a preacher, I'm always like, well, what are you reading? What are you reading? What are you reading? And I agree. I mean, like, Capon is wild. He's crazy. But
so
he
fun.
is also like absolutely in love with God. And so there's something really powerful about reading him and seeing kind of like how much imaginative room there is in the text. Like, you can be faithful and still there is so much room in the text. And I wouldn't even say we're not allegorizing or anything. It's just there's room in the text, and you're right. There's like 20 ways to preach a text.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is just one little bump on that. So John chapter 2 is probably my favorite story in the whole Bible, water to wine. And it's Capon who I first read when he approaches John chapter 2. So John intros this moment with Jesus by saying, on the third day, blah, 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 right?
That's right. Third day. That's right.
You can just read that and you're like, you just read past it. You just go, oh, yeah, water to wine, and the servants and the. And it's Capon who first showed me, oh, this is a resurrection passage. Mm-hmm. And then Capon says, well, if it's a resurrection passage, something's dead. What's dead? Yeah. And Capon says, it's the party that's dead. God is, first of all, the guy who's resurrecting parties. He's a God of celebration. And when I started reading that, Ted, I got filled with the Holy Ghost. I was like, this is how I want to preach. I want to preach with that kind of imagination when I come to the text. And it's just true. It doesn't take any of the other substance away from what other scholars or theologians might say. He's just always adding that fun layer to it. And it's like, oh man, I am so down. So roomy. And I like that you use the word roomy.
Well, and then you weren't reading Capon to prepare for a John 2 message.
No,
you were
I'm just
reading
reading.
Capon.
No, I'm just reading. Yeah, it's just like, man, I got to find something that keeps my heart alive.
That's the thing. I mean, there is something about the reading that, to use your words, keeps our hearts alive.
Yeah.
I have found that to be so true. So true.
Okay, let's go back to kryptonite before we wrap. That was your superpower, synthesis. Totally agree. Yes. What's your kryptonite?
My kryptonite, I have such a hard time, such a difficult time with concrete, with like, here's a story, here's an illustration, here is a metaphor.
Yes.
I have a hard time with them because in some ways, I find that I will think illustrations and metaphors to the death. I mean, that's the best way I can say it.
You take them all the way out.
Not quite right. The 2% here is not quite right. So that can't be the right one. So I don't know. There's like it feels like a little bit of a curse to me. I mean, like my wife reads all of my messages. Steve gives me lots of feedback on my messages.
Yes.
And Steve was always telling me more stories, because people remember stories. And I'm like, man, I try. It's hard for me. It's really hard for me. Yeah. So, the other thing that I would say too is, I don't know if this is the kryptonite, but I'm learning to preach to a diverse congregation.
Oh, well, say more about that. That's interesting. Yeah, because that would be one of the unique gifts of pastoring a church in Chicago.
Yeah, I think that like I think my eyes are open in ways, or my ears, I'm listening for things in other people's preaching that to me like have become priorities. So I want to look at all the people I'm quoting in a message and make sure that I have people of color that I'm quoting, like that kind of thing. Or if I have examples and I'm doing the kind of thing that like we're trying to talk about the good news for every single person in their location, I always want to make sure I'm thinking like about all of the people in the congregation and where they're from. And I would say that was a real weakness for me when I first started.
Well, that's just hospitality, though, isn't it? That's a way to be a hospitable preacher.
It is. It's a way to kind of give power back to the room. Yeah. In other words, and if you're listening, you're like, how do I get more diverse in my preaching? Man, I quote Dr. King so much. He is. You could find a quotation about anything from him that's poetic, that's deeply profound. Yeah. So I quote him all the time. Like he talked about, I used a quote recently about how death is not like, it's just a comma. It's not a period on this on the sentence of our lives, but it's a comma. And Amen. I mean, just little things like that. So that's something I feel like I'm growing in.
Too good. All right, Ted. We've been here almost an hour. Let's do this. I mean, there's like other things I want to ask you, but it's just going to have to be some other time and some other place. Ted, what do you want to say to people who are maybe beginning their journeys? Let's just land here. People who are listening to us today, and maybe they've only been preaching for a year or two, or maybe they're about to start preaching more, or maybe they're dealing with some of that stuff that you and I are dealing with and have dealt with. But people are beginning their journey. What do you want to say to Vineyard preachers who are kicking it off?
I want to go back to that kind of moment where I felt the power of the Spirit when we were talking, and we were talking about insecurity. And we were just talking about, you were sharing about ways in which we can kind of move through that. And I think those two things that you said were so powerful. They're true for me. If you are a person that's just starting your journey, who's your spiritual father? Who's your spiritual mother?
Yes.
And who is a person who has listened to hundreds of sermons that can be in your corner? And then I think just the work of the Spirit. This is like not an intellectual exercise.
Yes.
This is a partnership with the Spirit of God. And it took me a while to figure that out, but I mean, I so agree with what you were saying, Adam, about how it's only the Spirit that can kind of take that fear of man or that insecurity off of us. But even as our conversation went on, we were talking about the Spirit will help us even to prepare and to write, which is why we take these little breaks, or we go to sleep, or we run. So I just want to say that. And it feels to me that feels really important to pray into.
Yeah, and that's a Vineyard story too.
What would you say, Adam?
Oh, I think it's the same thing. It's like okay, so I want to just agree with everything you would say, and then I would also say this. It's okay to be an immature preacher. An immature, I'm talking about immature in the sense of a beginner. Like, gosh, it's fine. It's literally fine. It's okay to not be fully formed.
That's right.
It's totally okay. I mean, like Peter's first message on Pentecost, like the Spirit is helping him. And we know from the text that he later on gets some things wrong and needs to be corrected. Okay, it's fine. It's okay to be at the beginning of the journey. Wherever you're at, it's totally fine. Just get up knowing that God wants to speak to the church. And if he's choosing you, he's going to take care of it. He's going to take care of it. He's going to take care of you. He's going to take care of the people. He's going to take care of your church. And no one is expecting anyone to become, Tim Keller in 8 weeks. It just doesn't happen.
No one's expecting that. Or even 10 years or 15 or 20 years.
It just doesn't happen. So it's fine. So you enjoy the journey. I mean, there are things to enjoy about the beginnings of things. And, like they're, slightly different, but I think it still applies. There are things that I even miss about when our church was smaller. There are things we could get away with when we were 100 people that we can't get away with now. There were moments of when my family was me and Heather and 2 kids that I treasure. And it doesn't make it better than me and Heather and the 4 kids now. It's not better. It's just a precious and treasured thing. And so when you're beginning your journey of preaching, I would just say that's a precious and treasured thing. And don't despise it or let the weight of the journey or the length of the journey discourage you. It's all good. Like God is with you all the way.
Oh, that's so helpful.
Yeah, man. All right, everybody. Thanks for hanging with us. We got more coming your way. Peace to you wherever you're at.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.